I make my collage and then scan it and print it on the metal, and I'm having the shapes cut out, so it's not a square. It's sort of a free form. But I'd like to not lose the paper, so I'm trying to figure out ways in which I can either work paper in there or I was recently experimenting with printing on more like that kind of hard plastic that you see signs made on sometimes.
Right.
And you can heat that up with a hair dryer and kind of twist it. And so it's interesting because it's just really taking me into a sculptural realm, and that is pretty new for me because I've never been a sculptor.
Right.
Really.
And so, like at this point, that's kind of manifesting itself as relief.
Yes.
Right.
Exactly.
But do you think you'll go? Totally 3D at some point?
I don't know. I mean, I think that's the fun. Is like I'm really not sure where it's going to take me. I know that wherever, and I think artists often gyrate in circles, like you go and experiment something and then you find yourself coming back around. And I know I don't want to abandon paper. I really love the quality of paper, and I think it's a really interesting material. It's so old, and it's so much associated with like, analog, like books and maps and, the old way we used to get information and pictures and yet at the same time it continues to present itself as potentially fresh and new, and especially now in light of all the digital material, there's something even more, I think, kind of almost like, I don't want to sound like cheesy, but almost like mystical about paper. Like it's kind of, everything is so I like this back and forth between digital and paper.
No, right.
I don't want to lose that. So I'm not sure. I'm open to things. I think this is the kind of now fun part of.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. I had a conversation with a fellow artist the other day, and we were talking about, he does photography, and we were talking about another person that is also doing photography, and he was questioning why this other photographer was still holding on to using film versus why would you do that when digital is just it just frees you up in all these different ways. But I think part of it is probably the attraction you have to the paper is that there's something tactile, and there's like this more of a maker sort of feel associated with, and I think our culture right now is I think this generation is kind of trying to place value on the handmade. Like we've gotten to such a digital society that the handmade seems so foreign and exotic to us, right?
Yeah, and going back to theater, right. I kind of like, I think as humans, we're going to continue inventing technologies. They are just sort of the extension of ourselves, and that's a natural process. There's nothing unnatural about the fact that we have digital. It seems like a natural thing that it happened,
Right.
And I was just having a conversation the other day with my dad. And he was like, "Well, do you think you're going to make these into holographs?" I'm like, "Yeah, sure. If I had the capacity, if that comes around, I could totally be making holographic. Like, how beautiful would that be? Where you have layers of things that move around. Like, I can envision that. That little scene from.
I bet there's somebody at UTD that can help you with that. Right.
Right. But I also think, and I mentioned theater because there's this kind of need to reconnect with our bodies. So, and I do believe that artists are in this kind of funny position where by doing it yourself, you telescope that out. So in other words, it would be disingenuous of me to not transmit that pleasure that I get from the paper. And I think if I have it and I've put that into the work, then hopefully other people experience that too. And so I think it's kind of a multi-layered thing. Like there's a value of the handmade because it takes a different kind of time because there is this sort of, aspect of someone physically being involved with it. So I think that it's always going to have a place. I don't really see it going away. On the other hand, it's kind of, I guess for me, I don't want to limit myself. So I'm trying to find the sort of balance or the back and forth between these two things.
Right.
Because whenever I used to really honestly have almost like a reaction against technology, like sitting down and learning Photoshop or learning how to do digital photography. I was lazy. I would just hire people like, can you come take pictures for me? Can you scan this for? And that's fine too. But I think and then I'd have to ask myself, like, well, what is it that I'm having a reaction against? Like, why can't I learn how to do this? So I think putting ourselves in uncomfortable places, like that kitchen table was an uncomfortable place, but it led me somewhere else.
Sure.
And so I think where I see myself is kind of like toggling back and forth between paper and non-paper.
So, I mean, you don't necessarily... I don't think you necessarily have to put down one thing to pick up the other.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, I think in this day and age, I think the art world is comfortable and is welcoming and accepting of someone who has multiple bodies of work going on at the same time. Like, this is my 2D work, this is my painting, this is my sculpture. Hey, I'm also doing some short videos. And I think, and so I don't think there's as, I think at one point, artists were kind of encouraged to live in these silos.
Right.
And this is who you are, and, you're a painter. Mm-hmm. And this is you need to paint versus nowadays, I think I don't see any reason why. In, my experience is that when you do that, you will wind up discovering something in this second body that you're like, wow, I could really incorporate that in a new way over here in the first body. Right. Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think process is where it takes you in the direction that you need to be. Mm-hmm. And so that was the lesson, I mean, kind of that I got out of that time in Rome, which is like there are no parameters or way to be except the one that is the right way for you, and and thankfully, yes, it is a different time period where people are doing multiple types of projects, and even things that are even like social, kind of more social practices where it's about experience rather than even an object itself. So in that way, I feel like more old-fashioned. I'm still like making things, but I think that's a really great place that we've arrived at, that we can do so many different things and not feel like you have to commit to being a sculptor or a painter, And in a way, you actually realize that most artists were doing that. Like when the Jackson Pollock show was here, and I went and saw it, like he had made so many little sculptures, and you realize all these artists all along have been doing other things. It's just that those pieces were neglected or didn't get shown because there was this preference for these other things, or all of his trajectories about his history of painting. But they were pretty cool. They were really strange, weird little, sand casted. I thought they were fabulous.
Awesome.
And so, yeah, and then, maybe in another dozen years, like, people will only be looking at those and they'll be like, oh, the paintings.
Right.
I don't know. But, yeah.
But, yeah, in another 10 years, we'll be sitting down and talking about your sculpture work, right?
Right. So, my holographic sculpture.
You're the holographic sculpture, right? So it lives in this 3D realm. Yeah. And so tell me a little bit about your process, because, since you do love ink and mark making, do you ever sit down and make your own marks and cut those out for use?
I haven't done that in a while. it's a funny thing because if I recognize the image, then it's almost like more freeing for me not to work with my own material. Though I did that, it's kind of what led me to doing the collage I'm doing now. But I still do a lot of drawing, and I like to work with ink.
Okay.
And so I bought a little thing of at a yard sale, a little box of like the kind of vellum people use for invitations, you know, that's sort of semi-transparent.
Yeah.
And so I've been doing little drawings on that, and I think it's just triggers a different part of my mind. And I also make tons of little, they're almost kind of cutesy, but like I still go back to just like almost old-fashioned collage with figures in them, like kind of Dada looking, you know. If I see a dancer or a, you know, I don't know, some interesting Life magazine fashion advertisement or something, I keep all those, and occasionally I just want to do something with figures.
Right.
So sometimes I'll do that and then like draw, you know, color pencil on them, and again, it's one of those things where I think it's good to, well, I mean, there's no right or wrong way to do things. It's good for me. Like, I get stuck otherwise if I'm just repeating the same thing over and over again.
Got it. So, like, when I look at your, you know, the images of your work on your site, you've got it broken up into like 5 different groups.
Right.
So 5 different series.
Yeah.
How do those, in your mind, how do those differ from one another? Or is there a particular process that, or, you know, set of rules that you're using for each one, and that's how, you know, they manifest themselves in those different ways? Or
you know, what happens is that I don't work in one series. I tend to jump around. But then what's happening is as I jump around, I see that there's connection between pieces. A lot of it is driven by the material. So, you know, the ones that I was talking about that are more from those vintage sources, they have sort of a kind of a look, and they generated a certain kind of feel. And so I realized after a while, okay, well, this is sort of a body, and then I have these sort of skin and hair ones that have another, because it's skin and hair, I tended to cut out smaller pieces. And because you just don't have as much surface-wise. Right. So that's why they...
Unless you're starting with some really interesting photos, right?
True, right, exactly, which maybe, you know, there's something there. Yeah, I hadn't thought about that. But yeah, so they tend to be more kind of fragmented and fractal looking. And then, you know, and then I got this box. A friend of mine gave me a huge stack of older art magazines that had a lot of painters and paintings and sort of 80s and 90s paintings, and they had a certain print quality. And so I was working with those, but, you know, I don't want to get too stuck in that, so I'll move back and forth to things. But what happens is that I see that they're independently sort of developing in different ways. So, like, I have a whole set now of pieces I haven't put up on my website, but they are mimicking, because everything's been cut out, and off and on I'll go back to a square. And like, so I have a whole set that almost has the format of a Polaroid, like, you know, where it's skinny on the top and the sides, and then, and they're all black and white.
Okay.
And they're black and white square pieces. And I don't know why I do them, but off and on I'm just like, I get tired of working with all these sort of little teeny tiny pieces, and I like whole pages.
Okay.
So, but they're not in order. It's not like I do 5 of them. You know, it'll be one day I'm just working this way, and then I'll put it away, and then like a month later or 2 months later, I've realized, I've done 4 of these. This is starting to be like a kind of a idea.
Right.
So that's how they become organized. And then the other thing that's it's not a problem, but you know, when you're the artist, you're just making. But then at some point you become aware of the fact that if you're trying to like have a public and show them, that you have to sort of make what you're doing accessible and logical to people. Like, what the hell is this?
Right.
So I think